Kia ora, I'm Esther Robinson and I'm Director of Government Relations at One Plus One. Today I'm interviewing Phoebe, who is the author of The Right Hand, a book where she interviews chief of staffs across a number of different democratic countries around the world. And today we're unpacking what makes a really good leader, how we can build back trust in political institutions, and the role of chief of staff in democracies around the world.
A chief of staff, it's such a unique character because they're so influential, but you rarely know anything about them because I guess inherent in the role is that invisibility to, in a way, be as powerful as you can. So I grew up consuming those types of shows. Like, had always been interested in politics, and then went to university, started working in government. And at first I started in state politics. And then it wasn't until I moved to Canberra to work in federal politics at the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet that I first got exposed to the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and the PMO, which is the Prime Minister's office. And at the time I was there, the Prime Minister was Scott Morrison and his Chief of Staff was a man called John Kunkel. And I guess working at the department, whenever John was involved in meetings or decisions, we knew important things were happening. And that's why I guess from there, I just became very intrigued by the role. And it was funny, like we would Google John and there was nothing online about him. Like we could barely find any information. But in a way, what I learned quickly is he was in a way as powerful as the Prime Minister, which is also interesting in itself because he's not elected. Yet no one in Australia could really name the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister. So yeah, that's where the interest came from originally. And then I run a media startup called Missing Perspectives. And one day we got a follower on Instagram and it was Justin Trudeau's longtime Chief of Staff, Katie Telford. And they've worked together for well over 10 years now. And it was just getting to know her and we had a few catch-ups and it was like just the way she would talk about Justin. It just made me realize like she knew him in a way that few people would know, you know, a person like Trudeau. And that's where I got the idea for the book because I just thought it'd be fascinating to speak to all these people behind the biggest leaders of our time.
Totally. And I mean, one of often the chief of staff role is described as one of the hardest jobs in any country because you're kind of everything to everyone and there's no real formal job description. It kind of depends on what the leader needs and the makeup of the government. But I guess I've also sort of been reflecting on, you know, a lot of people that will be listening to this interview, Phoebe, are people that work in business and in corporate roles. And so I'm sort of trying to think what a comparable role would be in the private sector or in a corporate position. It's really hard to think of one. I mean, I think the closest we might get to would be a COO. But even then, that kind of doesn't quite really meet the kind of the gravitar of what a chief of staff does in a political environment.
Totally. And I think what makes it's funny you say that because I'm working on a second project at the moment that is looking at the role in business and tech and that space. And it's definitely different. But what I love about the political world is that trust and loyalty are so intrinsically linked to the role, and that person is very much loyal to their principle. And an interesting pattern I observed when doing the interviews was that a lot of people have only ever worked for their boss, and a bunch of them, when their principal stepped down from office, they're continuing to work with that person. Like they rarely go on to then become a chief of staff to a new political leader. Like it is so tied to the person they're working for. Whereas in other industries, it's very much just a practical kind of operation style role. And I guess the trust and loyalty isn't as important in that space, I would argue, than politics, which I mean, as you can imagine, is a very cutthroat environment as well, having worked in politics.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me, such a strong theme that came through in the book was whether a chief of staff can be friends with their principal, you know, in this case, the Prime Minister or the President. And they were also very reluctant to confirm or deny. And then obviously, as you explain, you know, they tend to be tied with them for the sort of the rest of their life, whether they like it or not. And so there is a real intimacy and deepness there that doesn't really reflect any other professional or personal relationships in the real world. Like it really is quite a unique relationship between a chief of staff and prime
And the funniest pairing, I interviewed Jonathan Powell, who was Tony Blair's longtime chief of staff, And they were a hilarious duo because they both insist they're not friends, but they kind of have that professional intimacy. Like Jonathan would wear Tony Blair's hand-me-down clothes. They would like do meetings in the morning when Blair was like in the shower and or when they were eating breakfast. But they
Yeah.
insist they're not friends, and that's because Jonathan kind of talks about how you need to have that boundary there to be able to give your boss frank and honest advice and challenge them. But I
Mm.
would argue they're definitely still friends. And even the day we did the podcast interview in London, they were getting dinner that night, even like however many years since they've left office. And I just think
Yeah.
the unique circumstances you're in, like they must be bonded in a way. Like even Katie Telford and Justin Trudeau and Raj and Jacinda, they were dealing with, you know, terrorist attacks,
Mm.
COVID, volcanic eruption, and you just think the cards that they were dealt, how could you not be friends and bonded in a way at the end of the
Trauma
day?
bonded.
It's trauma, but literally, Raj spoke about the vicarious trauma in a way from being in the role. Like, I think
Yeah.
that's a whole separate conversation about what the
Mm.
chief of staff has to absorb in environments like that. And also, a lot of it doesn't even make it to their principal because they kind of have to absorb a lot of
There was
the
a lot of
pain
that.
of the team and like dealing with stakeholders. So, yeah,
Yes.
it's fascinating.
You know, a lot of the chief of staffs that you interviewed talked about the need to, yes, while there is that kind of personal relationship and that friendship,
Mm,
the prime minister or the person who they're advising needs to be able to have someone that can also walk into the room and really
mm,
challenge them. And so I guess, you know, do you think that that is a really critical part of a leader selecting someone that's going
mm.
to advise them, that just can't necessarily be your best mate, or someone that
Yeah,
surrounding yourself with yes men or yes women that are going to tell you what you
totally.
want to hear? It's got to be someone that can challenge you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of them, I would say all of them said that would be one of the most important traits in a good chief of staff. And it's interesting. I was interviewing John Howard's chief of staff here, who was chief of staff to the Australian Prime Minister, John Howard, but then he went on to become the US ambassador
Yes.
for Australia. And we were doing the interview the week where people were speculating whether Biden would be stepping out of the race. And we
Right.
had this really interesting discussion about whether, I mean, it's been written about now, but whether Biden just had a camp of people who, like his inner circle, just weren't willing to have those conversations with him because the
Mm.
Biden circle have been there for, you know, over 2 decades. And whether those boundaries just weren't in place anymore, where they could have those difficult and frank discussions. So, yeah, absolutely. And what I loved talking to each chief of staff about is what happens when you disagree with your boss. Like, how does that process work? And a lot of them said, like, their job is to provide a different perspective, challenge your boss's thinking. But at the end of the day, you have to remember that they're the elected official and not yourself. So I found it fascinating. And it's funny, Raj kind of said there was never any point in debating Jacinda because she's just so good at, yeah,
Yeah, and
putting
she's,
an
you know,
argument forward. And
a very well equipped and well practiced debater herself that can
yes.
really lay out an argument and prosecute an issue pretty
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
But a really funny story. I think it was Biden's, or maybe Obama's chief of staff was saying that he said in an interview that the chief of staff never gets to tell their boss the good news. Like he would
Yeah.
get a good piece of news and walk down to the Oval Office to tell Obama, and then someone will have already told him. So they're like, your job is just only to tell your boss the bad news, and that's something you have
Yeah.
to be comfortable with. And
Yeah.
even, sorry, rambling, but male chiefs of staff to female leaders, so Raj
Mm.
and Julia Gillard's chief of staff here, spoke about how it was often their job to pass on what was being said in the media, you know, the misogynistic reporting and sexism and some of the really difficult commentary. They were the ones who had to tell their boss, and just what that was like when, I mean, for Julia Gillard, Chief of Staff Ben here, he was working for Australia's first female Prime Minister. So a
Mm.
lot of it was like very unprecedented. So, yeah, really difficult conversations with their bosses, but then also having to pick their like keep their boss going and focused.
Yes, I
Yeah.
found it interesting his comments in that chapter, Julia Gillard's chief of staff, that is, around how he thought that there was an opportunity for perhaps the administration, but especially business leaders in Australia, to stand up a bit more and to push back on some of the misogynistic rhetoric that
Mm,
was targeted at the Prime Minister. and there was sort of a void of leadership across the country in terms
Mm.
of combating that. I thought that was a very interesting reflection to
Totally.
have.
It was interesting comparing Julia Gillard's Chief of Staff's Ben's reflections on that time with Raj, his
Mm,
reflections on working with Jacinda. In that, I think it's clear that because New Zealand had a female prime minister before, perhaps like Raj and Jacinda and the team were more willing to call things out straight away. Whereas the time when Julia Gillard was prime minister here,
yeah,
a lot of it, they were just trying to figure out whether to call it out, like how to navigate it. So yeah, that was
yeah.
definitely interesting.
Now, picking up, you've mentioned Katie Telford a bit, who was a
Yes.
chief of staff to Justin Trudeau. But you kind of referenced there the sort of we've sort of talked about the smoke and daggers part of the role and how it's sort of behind the scenes. And often chief of staffs refuse to do interviews or refuse to kind of have any public visibility. You can't find them
Mm.
on the internet. But Katie took kind of a different view where she sort of said that the way that chief of staff shy away from the media and away from that public profile could actually be sort of detriment to the role and detriment to women because
Mm.
politics is a very male dominated very dominated workforce. I worked in politics for a number of years and was often one of the few women in the room. So
Mm.
do you agree? Do you agree that maybe chief of staffs need to start changing the smoke and daggers perception and start
Yeah,
being a bit more visible, start promoting the role and making it more
totally.
accessible and inclusive?
Yeah. And so Katie Telford, like it was fascinating when she started following us. I was kind of like looking at her Instagram page and her Instagram bio was like chief of staff to Trudeau mother. Like she was very much like building a very public personal brand and also providing this total behind the scenes lens on her job. Like her Instagram, I
Mm.
recommend everyone go and check it out because the photos are amazing
Yeah,
about what her job looks like behind the scenes. Like even to this day, like she was in Davos and what that looks like going there with
yeah,
Trudeau. And it was, I think, why people are so drawn to her content is that you rarely see what a chief of staff to a world leader is like. And getting her on board, like I think she was the first person to agree to be a part of the book. And she kind of said that, I mean, to your point, that she wants to be more public and kind of buck the trend of the invisible chief of staff so that she is trying to do her part to drive female representation in the role. And she also spoke to me about how Trudeau asked her to be his chief of staff when she was on mat leave with her baby. So she also
mm,
was very public in being a chief of staff, bringing her child into work and just making that the
yes,
norm. And also using her role as chief of staff to really drive outcomes for women.
mm,
So it was fascinating talking to her about that. But I would say, like, talking about Katie's approach with other chiefs of staff in the book, a lot of them are very adamant that the role does have to be invisible. And they're kind of like, if you're in the news, then it's a bad day and you're not doing your job effectively. So there's definitely still the traditional view that the role should be invisible. But I do find it interesting that the female chiefs of staff are being very public, including Tulia, who's Santa Marin's chief of staff. She's
yes,
also has a really strong personal brand. Even Mamdani in New York, his chief of staff is a young woman. She's very much
mm,
doing a lot of interviews and representing him in the media. So I also wonder whether it's a new generation of chiefs of staff coming up, but also female chiefs of staff who are wanting to challenge that invisibility.
yes. And I guess, this kind of also touches on the significant personal sacrifice that's required in the role,
Mm.
particularly around family and health. I mean, when I worked under Jacinda Ardern's administration, obviously she was our first prime minister to have a child in office. And so it was a very child-friendly working environment. Lots of people,
Mm.
male and female, had their children in the office while we were working sort of 12-hour days and beyond. But that was kind of normal. And I think, a few of the people you interviewed that talked about having children in the office, how that kind of breaks down a lot of tension and brings
Mm.
some more lighthearted and human elements by having children in the office. And I guess we're starting to see that reflected through in corporate environments as well, where
Mm.
places are trying to become more family friendly. We've got more work from home. I mean, I would argue you can't really work from home if you're the chief of staff. You have to
Yeah.
be on pretty much most of the time, and
Yeah.
constantly on call. But yeah, do you think that the role is starting to change and move perhaps
Mm.
closer to where the corporate world is, which is to have a bit more
Yeah.
to be a bit more family friendly and to think more about people's general well-being. Do you think there's
Mm.
evidence of that, or is it still very much got a long way to go?
I think, I mean, my view from the interviews that I did was that the sacrifice is immense. And I think a lot of them, most of their reflections were on the toll that it really did take on them and their families. And Raj, even so, he also had his kids when he was chief of staff for Jacinda Ardern, and he shared this story in our interview where I think he had like a rare Sunday off and he took his two daughters to a birthday party and they jumped in the pool and started swimming, and he realized like he'd totally missed that milestone where they had learned how to swim. And that for me, and I think for him, I think from memory it was towards the end of his time in office, and maybe that played a role in him deciding to step down. But most of the people who are kids really did say, like, it is you're sprinting a marathon. And I also think because a lot of them know they're only in the role for a set period of time, like maybe that's where it's different to business and the corporate world, that they kind of just give it their all and you have to give it your all. But yeah, I would say I hope that it has come a little further, and like people like Katie Telford, she definitely had her way, like, you know, should wind down with her son, like watch Grey's Anatomy, kind of had try and have like some kind of peace during the week. But a lot of it are just kind of like it's a 24/7 all in. And Julia Gillard's chief of staff, Ben, he had a newborn baby when he started working for her, and he just had to get a house right near Parliament House and would duck home at night for like 30 minutes and then just come back in. So yeah, I would say it's a role where there just isn't the work-life balance, and I think that's something they all accept.
And particularly when there kind of becomes a crisis, kind of as we've already discussed, you know, the COVID years for the chief of staff that worked during COVID, the enormous stress and pressure of dealing with a global pandemic, and the enormity of that, and of course then the sort of political backlash and mis and disinformation that was associated with that period. You know, do you think that there is a particular type of leadership style or a particular type of personality that can deal with that level of stress and help shepherd their own leader who they're advising through that period? Because I mean, I feel like most people would break under that level of pressure.
Yeah, I think the trend that I found amongst all the people I interviewed was that being calm under pressure is probably like one of the most important traits. And also at the end of the day, you've got to remember, I can't remember who said this in the interview, but the role is literally chief of staff, and you're responsible for also managing staff and a team. So particularly the leaders, I think, during COVID were, and also, you know, again, like the cards that Raj and Jacinda were dealt, Raj was also having to manage a team of people, and I think he had to be an effective leader and that had to have the trust of the team, had to make sure there was psychological safety for the team. So obviously it was such an intense time for the country, particularly with the terrorist attack. And then also making sure that he can kind of act as the gatekeeper to the leader and make sure that Jacinda was focused on the priorities at the time. So yeah, I would say like being the anchor and being calm is probably the most important trait, particularly because so many of the chiefs were chiefs during the pandemic and Ukraine even. Like listening to Tulia, because I mean, people forget that Finland had like that long standing practice of neutrality that the two of Chief Tulia and Sana decided to join NATO. And the decision making and what their team went through over that week was immense. So yeah, I'm not really answering your question, but I think it would be being able to effectively manage the team and then help their leader stay focused and be focused on priorities. And it's interesting hearing the chiefs of staff who also felt responsible for their leaders' well-being. Like Ben Hubbard, Julia Gillard's chief of staff, would make sure, like even down to things like that she was eating breakfast when she was really busy, that she was getting in her personal training. Whereas there were other camp of chiefs of staff who were very much professionally focused. And I think that's where each of them kind of had a different approach to the role. And I guess that's down to what the principal needed at the time.
And I guess flowing on from that, you know, sort of talking about the COVID era and the kind of backlash that we've had in politics, and we're becoming more of I guess there's sort of trends throughout, and there's evidence to support this, that we have an all-time low trust in politics and institutions at the moment. There's deep cynicism in political leaders, and you know, people questioning you know, media sources and where they're getting their information. Were you conscious of this kind of shift when you wrote this book? I mean, obviously you talked about your general curiosity of the role, and exposed to these political roles in your career,
Mm.
but were you kind of aware of this kind of deep cynicism and low trust mood across the world when you wrote this book?
Mm. So it's funny because the project originally was going to be a podcast series, which is still coming out later this year. So I'd been working on the podcast series for around 2 years. Like I think I started maybe at the end of, I think at the start of 2023. So I've been working on the project all up, like obviously it then evolved into the book for like 2.5 years. And what happened over the course of those 2.5 years, I think, as you just said, like we saw Trump come back. And obviously, the events we're seeing play out today, we're seeing trust at an all time low, particularly with young people. We're seeing, I mean, arguably democracy being undermined. And I just think for me, that's why I ended up reflecting at the end of the book around how much has changed over the last 2.5 years and how speaking to this group of people really restored my faith in institutions and democracy. Because I guess at the end of the day, you have to remember like these institutions are made up of people. And as long as we have good people in those institutions, hopefully they can withstand the shocks and forces that they're coming up against. And the last two interviews I did were with the oldest chief of staff I interviewed, who was Nelson Mandela's chief of staff, Barbara
Yes.
Masekela. She was the last interview I did. And Sana Marin's chief of staff, Tulia, who was the youngest. And I think that just happened coincidentally, but hearing both of their perspectives on what keeps them optimistic, I think really shone a light on the fact that I also wanted the book to be a call to action for young people as well to really become more civically engaged. Because at the end of the day, both women kind of said it's the next generation, them coming up and, you know, having an interest in government and politics that can help move us forward. So, yeah.
That's really powerful and interesting. And I guess if for my final question, before we wrap up, what would you have a sort of a call to action to perhaps business leaders or people working in the corporate space and how they might feel distanced from politics and might not be able to kind of really relate to some of this conversation. But what kind of is a lasting message that you want people in business to take with them as sort of a call to action on how to engage in politics?
I think with the book, I guess with the book, what I really wanted to do was expand the remit of what leadership looks like. Because I think there's often the narrative, particularly in a very, you know, news and media driven world that we're living in, where it's like clickbait and sound bites and like very much, you know, egos dominate the news. But often, yes, we have the world leaders and the principals and the public figures, but there are also as powerful and influential people just in the wings who are out of center and out of the spotlight. And so I guess I would say expanding, you know, what leadership looks like. And it's not always the people in the spotlight, it's people who often don't get the recognition, but their roles are in a way like as powerful.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that's interesting for us in New Zealand right now because we are heading into an election year.
Yeah.
And we have an MMP system where we have multiple chief of staffs advising in the current situation with the Prime Minister, but also the two leaders of the other parties. And so I guess, you know, that's something that people might be interested in is the personalities behind the people advising them. And at the moment, we have a full male contingent of chief of staff, which is nothing wrong with that, but perhaps they lean more to that kind of more traditional role where they are behind the scenes and out of the limelight, but they're sort of critical players. Yeah.
Oh, it's interesting.
So thank you very much, Phoebe. That was a really interesting conversation, and we will leave it there.
That's good. Thank you for having me.